Hi, good morning. I'm Joel Simon. I'm the Executive Director of the Committee to Protect Journalists, and why don't we get started? First, I want to thank you all very much for being here today for the release of Attacks on the Press. Here it is, Attacks on the Press. This is our annual survey of press freedom conditions around the world, and we're very happy to be launching it here at the United Nations for a number of reasons, which I'll get into in just a moment. So I want to introduce you to my colleagues who are joining me, Nina Ognianova, who directs our Europe and Central Asia program, Sherif Mansour, who directs Middle East and North Africa, and Mohamed Keita, the Advocacy Coordinator for our Africa program. I'm going to speak briefly. They're going to speak briefly about some of the regional issues they see, and afterwards we'll stick around and we'd be happy to talk to anyone one-on-one. In terms of languages, I think we can do Spanish, Bulgarian, Russian, Arabic, and French. Leave anything out? Okay. So the format for Attacks on the Press has changed slightly this year. The print edition of the book contains about 20 essays, and we're looking at press freedom challenges from a regional and thematic perspective. And some of the issues we look at are the tug of war between media and money, the dangers to witnesses and journalist killings, the grit and determination of local reporters covering the Syria conflict, and the wide-ranging effects of government surveillance. So in the forward to, this is just in the print edition, in the forward to the print edition, CPJ board member and Slate chairman Jacob Weisberg looks at the impact of the Snowden revelations on national security reporting, and he notes that when the press asserts the need for public accountability, it is invariably accused of helping the bad guys. If one posits a stupid enough terrorist, this becomes an argument against ever reporting anything. This year's country profiles and data, meanwhile, are published on cpj.org, not in the book, they're just online. But let me remind you of some of the key numbers. 70 journalists were killed in 2013, 211 journalists in prison at the end of the year. These numbers, in our view, are the leading indicators of global press freedom conditions, and in 2014, they were at near record levels. Not that long ago, the battleground for press freedom was really contained or confined within the borders of autocratic states. While Article 19 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights guarantees the right to seek and receive information regardless of frontiers, in reality it was national governments through censorship and violence that set the boundaries for freedom of expression. But technology has allowed the ideals represented by Article 19 to actually be realized. Today, information has become a shared global resource and the engine of the global economy. The United Nations has a critical responsibility to ensure that the right to freedom of expression is respected in practice. So how can this be achieved? Let me highlight three areas. First, the UN must defend freedom of expression online. The UN must never allow itself to be used to control the internet. Instead, it must fight to ensure that the transnational space for freedom of expression remains open and free. Some countries, notably China, Iran, Russia, would like to see the UN take a greater role in internet governance. But what they really want is to use the UN as cover to censor and control online speech in their own countries. Instead, the US must defend and strengthen the multi-stakeholder model of internet governments. It should support the establishment of global norms limiting government surveillance and prohibiting censorship or prior restraint. In these efforts, the UN must be guided by principles enumerated by UN Special Rapporteur for Freedom of Expression, Frank LaRue, and affirmed by resolution of the UN Human Rights Council, which states the same rights that people have offline must be protected online. In particular, freedom of expression, which is applicable regardless of frontiers and through any media of one's choice. These issues are explored in this book in greater detail in the chapter entitled Under Surveillance. In that chapter, I look at the way the NSA scandal has given ammunition to internet-restricted countries like China, while CPJ Internet Advocacy Coordinator Jeff King writes about how the ever-expanding ability of governments to suck up vast amounts of data poses a direct threat to the work of the press. What else does the U.S. need to do? The UN need to do? It needs to lead in the fight against impunity. Last year, the Security Council held 2 debates on the safety and security of journalists, covering conflict and the issue of impunity. In December, the General Assembly passed a resolution condemning the killing of journalists and establishing November 2nd as the International Day to End Impunity in Crimes Against Journalists. Meanwhile, UNESCO is implementing a multi-sectoral plan to beat back the culture of impunity. Now, these commitments are really important because they establish that violence and impunity have a global chilling effect on the work of the media, inhibiting the ability of the UN to confront key challenges ranging from the protection of civilians in armed conflict, which the Security Council, of course, is taking up today, to combating sex trafficking. This year, the goal for the United Nations must be to move from words to action. The fact remains that in 90% of all journalist murders, no one is ever brought to justice. These crimes are never solved. And in a chapter in this book entitled Getting Away with Murder, Elizabeth Witchell looks at how the killers of journalists thwart justice by murdering witnesses to those crimes. And John Otis, who is the Andes correspondent for CPJ, looks at the challenges of pursuing justice in Colombia, even as the level of violence declines in that country. Third thing that the United Nations must do, combat poverty by expanding access to independent information and press freedom. More than ever, we live in a world in which information is power. Sadly, too many people are powerless because they lack access to independent information. As the target date of the 2015 Millennial Development Goals draws near, the UN must expand access to information, and that means supporting technological innovation and ensuring that everyone's right to seek and receive information is respected in practice. Independent media that allow people to hold governments accountable is fundamental to achieving sustainable development. As CPJ Deputy Director Rob Marney writes in an essay in this book entitled Putting Press Freedom at the Heart of Anti-Poverty Efforts, the role of journalists and bloggers empowered by new technologies in helping to improve the lives of ordinary citizens has never been clearer, and the price some of them pay in terms of their own lives and liberty has never been higher. International and regional institutions that promote economic development or security are increasingly aware of the role journalists as defenders of human rights, vital to promoting transparent and accountable government. And now I'll ask Nina to say a few words.
I'm going to talk about 2 countries that over the past year has gone progressively more repressive for journalists, and these are Russia and Turkey. In Russia, current climate for freedom of the press and the freedom of expression, despite the international spotlight due to the Sochi Olympic Games, has not been as repressive since the collapse of the Soviet Union. Russia has passed multiple legislations restricting freedom of the press and freedom of expression since Putin's 3rd presidential inauguration. Russia censored directly or intimidated into self-censorship media outlets and individual journalists through bureaucratic harassment, preventative detentions, politically motivated inspections and prosecutions, obstruction and airbrushing of critical coverage, and harassment of sources. Impunity has continued to be the norm in violent crimes against journalists. In Turkey, which for a 2nd year in a row, there have been more jailed journalists than anywhere else in the world, 40 media representatives behind bars in retaliation for their work in all. Turkey continued to crack down on critical journalists in response to their reporting and commentary, including commentary that was made on social media. In the aftermath of the Gezi Park protests, authorities pressured media owners into getting rid of inconvenient voices that had covered the events in an independent manner. Dozens of reporters, commentators, and columnists were dismissed. Turkey failed to reform its multiple anti-press laws, and it introduced a new internet bill most recently that, if signed into law, would allow authorities to block news online without a court approval. And I will be happy to expand on these points as well as to talk about the other countries that are part of my my beat at CPJ after that.
Sherif, you want to talk about the Middle East and North Africa?
Sure. If you're talking about the Middle East, and basically I'm going to run through some of the numbers. We talked earlier about how killed journalists and imprisoned journalists is one of the indicators that we use to measure global trends. In the Middle East, unfortunately, there is a lot of unprecedented deterioration in many countries. Syria remains the most dangerous country in the world. We've witnessed so far and documented more than 63 cases of killed journalists since the uprising against Bashar al-Assad started, including 29 who were killed last year. We also have an unprecedented number of kidnapping. We have on the record more than 80 kidnapping cases of journalists since 2011, including 57 who were kidnapped last year alone. In addition, in terms of press environment, in Syria, we documented more than 70 journalists who've been forced to exile. If we're talking about the region as well, Iran remained the second jailer of journalists around the world. We've documented 35 journalists behind bar at the end of the year. We're still waiting to assess whether President Rouhani is going to deliver on his promises in terms of press freedom. We're going to focus on that in the upcoming year. Number three, Egypt have seen probably the most deterioration in its press record. For the first time, it was among our top jailers of the world census, with 9th position globally. It was also the third most deadliest country for the press in 2013, with 6 journalists being killed. Iraq still a major area of concern. At the end of the year, in the last quarter alone, 10 journalists were killed because of their work. That's comparing to 0 in 2012. It's a return of an era where Iraq was the worst and the most deadliest country for journalists during the 10 years of the occupation. There is one good news in the region. Tunisia have adopted a better constitution, articles on press freedom. Libya is still struggling. There is a lot of violence and kidnapping for journalists. Same goes to Yemen. A lot of censorship in Sudan. That's the headlines. I'm going to also answer any questions you might have later.
Thank you very much, Sherif. Mohamed, you want to do a rundown of the situation in Africa?
Sure. In sub-Saharan Africa, we noted that a grave press freedom crisis persists in countries like Ethiopia, Somalia, the Democratic Republic of the Congo, and the Gambia. We also noted that there are alarming trends or backsliding in countries that are relatively democratic, such as Tanzania, Zambia, Liberia, Kenya, and even South Africa. And on the subject of South Africa, there is one essay in this book where we look at the legacy of Nelson Mandela. One of his legacies was the freest press in Africa, which is enduring in today's South Africa, despite repeated assaults from his very followers. We also look at the issue of soft censorship of advertisers, especially in East Africa. Advertising as a reward or punishment for news coverage, how news managers are more and more pressured by profit margins and the challenge of reporting the news, especially reporting stories that have to do with the special interest of commercial companies, interest of governments, private sector. And then finally, we also look at the contest to define journalism for sustainable development, especially as we head towards post-2015. The new popular narrative of Africa rising is, in fact, giving new life to an archaic concept of developmental journalism, this idea that journalists should be reporting positive news. Now, this pressure is nothing new, but it is being given a new life by the prospects of Africa, the unprecedented decade of growth, and a lot more journalists are, being branded as, traitors or terrorists in many countries for reporting inconvenient truths that kind of contradict this popular narrative. And of course, I'd be happy to give you more detailed insights into many other things.
Thanks so much. Questions? The first one's over here.
Thank you, Joel. Indeed, welcome again. We do appreciate your annual report. It became traditional. We got used to it, and we were looking forward to hear it. On behalf of the United Nations Correspondent Association, I welcome you all. My name is Erol Avdovic. I represent Web Publica Press. I do have one general question and probably one to Ms. Ognianova. And the general one would be, how do you cope indeed to help, it's to everybody, to help and to protect, as Mohamed actually mentioned several examples of how that censorship is going on, in which ways, to protect those journalists who are somehow involved by their consent or without their consent, actually, for many benefits, including the economic one in the auto-censorship and then even the government propaganda. And also, as Ms. Ognianova offered, to expand a little bit more on the internet law in Turkey, bearing in mind that the government is trying to justify that the law was adopted by the Turkish parliament because of the protection, and I'm quoting, of course, not saying my opinion, because of the protection of the privacy. Thank you.
Okay, well, first on the first question, which was a really sort of definitional, what journalists do we defend? We take the broadest possible definition of journalism. We defend all sorts of journalists. We defend journalists who we identify with and admire. We defend journalists who we disagree with. Obviously, technology has utterly transformed the way that journalism is accomplished, and there are all sorts of people engaged in journalism, work that we consider to be journalism, documenting and disseminating newsworthy events to the public, and when they when that activity is suppressed, we take up those cases. I don't know if that answers your question, but that's the broad framework in which we work. We've always taken the broadest possible definition of journalism. That definition has expanded as technology has transformed the way that news and information is gathered and disseminated around the world. So I'll let Nina talk about the situation in Turkey.
Yeah, I mean, the Internet bill is an amendment to already a very restrictive Internet bill in Turkey that's allowing for the blocking of websites, of news platforms that are deemed harmful, that are deemed pervasive of privacy. And that law had already been used arbitrarily to silence critical of the policies of the AKP government in Turkey. But now with this new amendment to the already repressive laws, the government is doing some extra steps to overstep the judicial approval of its actions to censor information online. The provisions are very vaguely worded. They offer a plethora of interpretations that could be taken by the Turkish authorities. They allow for the blocking of URLs. They allow for the centralization of internet service providers into a single service provider that will be very easily manipulated and controlled by the government. And they, like I said, they overstep the judicial approval of these actions. So the government first could pass an order to block a certain website and then file for a court approval, which, you know, we've seen the record in Turkey that in many cases the courts are rubber stamping what the authorities want them to, the actions that authorities want them to take against the internet voices.
Okay, other questions? Let's see, we've got a lot in the front row. Go ahead.
Thank you very much, Edith Lederer from the Associated Press. Joel, you said that last year 70 journalists were killed, 211 were imprisoned, and this was a near record level. Yeah. What and when was the record, and what do you attribute this to for last year? And as a quick second question, I note that there wasn't any representative from Asia here, and I note that in the chapter titles in the book, there's something about journalists in Hong Kong and Taiwan battling Beijing's influence by an unnamed CPJ contributor. I wonder if you could address that.
Okay. So first question, remind me.
The first question was on the numbers.
Oh, yeah, the numbers. Okay. So, yes, this is near record, and 2012 were record. So 232 journalists in jail at the end of 2012, 72 journalists killed. That was a tie for the worst, most deadly year with the height of the violence in Iraq. So basically the numbers this year are comparable to the numbers in 2013 are comparable to the numbers in 2012. So the last 2 years have been absolutely atrocious, the worst ever in CPJ's history. Now, why? There are a number of dynamics. You've got this horrific conflict in Syria, comparable to Iraq in terms of the number of journalists being killed. No respect whatsoever for the work of the media. Journalists are being targeted. Journalists are being killed in crossfire. It's become so deadly that it's almost impossible to cover, except for local media activists who self-describe themselves. Imprisonment, the framework for increasing imprisonment around the world is anti-terror, and that's a long-term trend. Most of the journalists in prison in Turkey, which is the world's leading jailer of journalists, are jailed on anti-terror charges. So I think that's, you know, if you look at the framework for both of those two developments, I would say that's it. In terms of Asia, we would have loved to have Bob Dietz here, our Asia program coordinator, but there was a limit of the number of people we could bring. So I'm pinch hitting for Bob. I'm happy to answer a question or two on Asia. In terms of the CPJ contributor, I think it sort of speaks for itself. That person decided that they could not have their byline on the piece without endangering that person. And you know, we obviously we have a journalistic sensibility. We want to be able to publish with bylines, but we couldn't endanger this person, and so at the request of this person, we removed it.
Well, then could you just briefly discuss the situation in China?
In China, well, I mean, the essay looks at Hong Kong and Taiwan, and what's particularly alarming in both of those places, but Hong Kong especially, is that this has been a bit of a safe haven. And a place where the media could cover developments in mainland China with greater freedom and autonomy, and that position that Hong Kong has held, that special position, is being compromised by pressure, both direct and indirect, from Beijing on the media, and that's being translated into increased self-censorship and less probing coverage on the activities of mainland China. Okay, so Matt, why don't you go ahead and ask your
Thanks
question?
a lot. Matthew Lee, Inner City Press, on behalf of the Free UN Coalition for Access. Thanks for the briefing. I wanted to ask, I was looking last night at the by continent, and so under Africa, I was hoping to see South Sudan or Mali. So I'm going to ask you a question about, since the UN has peacekeeping missions in both of them, it seems like, even though maybe it's South Sudan would be one of the countries you'd say is more like a democracy now, but it seems even before the fighting started, something called the Juba Monitor was confiscated. So what can you say about the trend in South Sudan and also in Mali, whether the UN does enough? There's a website called Mali Actu that's reported a lot on corruption there, and I've asked in this room sitting right here for the UN to comment on it, and they don't. And I wonder, do you think overall that the UN uses its peacekeeping missions and where it has an actual presence to do something? And on Sri Lanka, I wondered if you're pinch hitting on Asia, what's the trend there? And this murder of Mel Gunasekera, is that viewed by you as the murder of a journalist? Thanks.
Okay, well, I'm going to let Mohamed talk about South Sudan and Mali. He's very familiar with the situation in both of those places.
Yes, with South Sudan, unfortunately, as the newest nation in Africa, it hasn't learned anything from the mistakes of other countries, and the country from the beginning has been trending towards getting more and more repressive. We have documented patterns of censorship, arbitrary arrests, closures of media outlets. Reporting on corruption is very risky. So the press is not free. Unlike what the foreign minister declared a couple of days ago in London, the journalists in South Sudan work under a lot of pressure. In Mali, 2012 was the worst year ever for the press in Mali. Record number of attacks, especially in the north with the militants. 2013 was a lot better, significantly, dramatically better, because the conflict abated, and we basically had a situation where journalists sort of found a sense of stability or normality. As for that situation, I remember that over the summer, in the lead up to the elections, we were very fearful that some radio stations would be targeted by militants of one of the presidential contenders. And I remember that at the time that we were in touch with the UN peacekeeping mission, and we drew their attention to this and requested assistance just to prevent this kind of attack from happening. The attack ended up not happening, but the UN at least was responsive and prepared to respond, which is encouraging. And then, what was your other question?
With Sri Lanka, I'm actually going to come back to you in Sri Lanka and have our Asia program contact you directly, because I'm not sufficiently familiar. I think I want to go to the front row has been dominating, so I'll go to the middle row there. Yes.
Thanks. And another one, since you warmed up now, Mohamed, another one for you on Africa specifically. You spoke about the alarming trends in sub-Saharan Africa, you mentioned, including South Africa, despite it having a very free press and a strong civil society. What are you noticing in this post-Mandela era in South Africa? What concerns you the most? And I see my company, the SABC, is also mentioned in this book. Perhaps speak specifically about the SABC, if you will.
Well, the SABC, as the public broadcaster, has, of course, its mandate is to be inclusive and pluralistic. But in recent years, we have seen a pattern where coverage critical of the African National Congress has been suppressed. There's a very documented pattern of censorship of critical content at the South African broadcaster. And unfortunately, the trend in South Africa is that the ANC is on a secrecy bent. Obviously, there is this repressive legislation called the Protection of State Information Bill that sailed through Parliament, and that's before the president. And this legislation would essentially criminalize investigative journalism in South Africa, and we see it as a response to the probing coverage that the South African media has been doing on corruption, on mismanagement, and a lot of corruption scandals. Of course, the South African press has not gotten it right at all times. It has at times made mistakes, but sometimes these have been has been used by the government to justify censoring the press or establishing a statutory government-run media tribunal. The rhetoric has been more hostile, and there is a clear intent by the South African government to bring the media under control. And so we are very concerned. A number of investigative journalists have been placed under indefinite police investigation. The government has used apartheid-era legislation to block access to information of public interest. So, we're hopeful, though, the South African system of government, with its strong judiciary, with the strong civil society, so far has withstood many of these attacks. And so we will be monitoring and watching very closely.
Is there a question on the Middle East? Because that has not been, there you go. I'll take that.
Kristen Salumi from Al Jazeera English. As I'm sure you know, 4 Al Jazeera journalists are being held in Egyptian prisons right now and charged with supporting the Muslim Brotherhood. I'm wondering if you can comment specifically, Mr. Mansour, on their case and generally on the government's use of aiding a terrorist organization in order to crack down on the military government's use of this charge to crack down on dissent.
Well, clearly we've spoke out against this more than once, but as Joel expanded earlier, the governments like Turkey have used terrorism charges to go to crack down on journalists. In Egypt, that was unprecedented in this case. We see it as an attempt by the government to criminalize legitimate journalistic work. Those journalists were picked up from their hotel. They had only their equipments with them. Some of the charges against them has to do with their communication with sources, including Muslim Brotherhood. There was no weapons found in their hotel. There was nothing that incites violence. So we are expecting that their trial is going to be dismissed and they'll be found innocent. Their first hearing is next week. We've called for the release. There is a big campaign, hashtag Free AG Staff. It's very popular. There are a lot of solidarity around the world from journalists for their case, including from people inside Egypt. We hope that will result in at least improvement of their imprisonment and also dropping the charge against them soon.
Okay, there are a bunch of questions. Why don't I take 2 more? Let's start with you in the front row.
Thank you. Sia from Scan News. Sherif, you spoke about Iran. I was wondering if since the new president came to power, anything has been changed towards the way they look at the journalists, the way they freedom of press there, or it was just a campaign promises? Thank you.
There is a specific article in the book about that, assessing Rouhani's presidency potential in terms of press freedom. There are, of course, many ways to look at it. One of them is also imprisonment. Since 2012, there were 45 journalists behind bars. Last year, when we counted at the end of the year, it was 35. So we see that in terms of numbers at least, less journalists are held behind bars. But when we look through the cases, most of these were just journalists who spent their time in jail. Many of them were released on law, so they could be arrested again. We don't see a lot of hope in terms of seeing tangible results, but there are a lot of promises and we're monitoring them closely. We want to see structural change, not just a release here and there. We want to see the press syndicate allowed to return. We want to see the laws amendment, and want to see less interference by the government, including security and intelligence service and the press.
Thank you. I have just one follow-up on the number of the journalists who's been killed this year.
Yeah.
What's the percentage of them are cameramen and photographers? Thank you.
That one of the things that's on our website, we are able to break all of that down. I'm sorry I don't have that at my fingertips, but we can get that for you by the time this press conference is over. So we'll have that information, but I don't have it at the tip of my fingers. I want to get Pamela, and I want to get one question on Latin America since we haven't had one. So let's go.
Right,
to
just a
Pamela
quick
first.
follow-up,
Yeah, okay.
actually, for
Yeah,
Sherif
yeah.
on my colleague Kristen's question. On the Al Jazeera detentions and convictions, or at least detained in prison, have you heard from any journalist organizations in Egypt? You've obviously condemned this several times, and several other news organizations have, about, I mean, this seems to be a ramping up of harassment of journalists. Have you heard about anyone in country that is trying to put pressure? Have you gotten any kind of feedback on this on the campaign? Thank you.
Sure, there is a climate of fear right now that is, I think the government is trying to intimidate journalists, including Al Jazeera, but also other journalists, like people who were not even critical to the government, including someone like Karim al-Bahiri for Al-Badil, which is a leftist organization, news media organization. We are working with partners, including the press syndicate in Egypt, who are trying to help journalists when they get into trouble. We see a pattern of detention as punishment for journalists. We've documented more than 45 cases of detention of journalists and assaults directly against journalists. There is a media vilification against journalists, including foreign correspondents. We see journalists more and more complain about lack of access and also intimidation by government and people in the streets. So this is one of the reasons Egypt now has been one of the third deadliest country for journalists, and also on our watch list for most deteriorated risk countries in 2013.
Okay, I'm going to take one last question, and just want to make clear we will stick around as long as necessary for one-on-one discussions. But let me take the last question over there from Carmen Maria, since we haven't had one on Latin America. I assume that's what you're going to ask about. Yeah.
Mr. Simon, thank you. I don't see Carlos Lauria, but
yes, I'm pinch hitting for Carlos.
Thank you.
I'll do my best.
Mexico, how dangerous is it this year with the corruption and the drug cartels? And second, Cuba is no longer among the leading jailers of journalists. What does that mean? Thank you.
Okay. Okay, on Mexico, there's a very, in my view, very compelling piece by Mike O'Connor, who was CPJ's representative in Mexico. Wonderful, wonderful journalist, just passed away. This is his last piece, and he describes in detail how drug cartels have penetrated the outskirts of Mexico City. This is a huge story. This is a huge story for that country, and it is not being covered because the same tactics that the drug traffickers are using in the rest of the country, they are using in Neza, with Ciudad Nezahualcóyotl, which is on the outskirts of Mexico City. And so this is a phenomena which the government would like to suggest is not affecting the capital. Mike O'Connor, in his last story in this book, made clear that it is, and this remains a national level threat. On Cuba, what should we make of the fact that there are no journalists in jail in Cuba? Obviously very positive. It's the result, in my view, of a sustained international campaign that shows that, while Cuba has suggested it's resistant to this kind of pressure, it can be effective. But the one thing we should not conclude is that conditions have dramatically improved for journalists in Cuba. They have not. It remains one of the most repressive, censored countries in the world for the media. No independent media, no access to the internet for the general population. So good news, fewer journalists are in jail, but let's not conclude based on that conditions have improved for journalists in Cuba. And as I said, that we'll end it there, but we'll stick around as long as necessary to take all of your questions. Thank you very much.